This is for Palestine, Ramallah, West Bank, Gaza. This is for the child that is searching for an answer. This is not just a war over stolen land. Why do you think little boys are throwing stones at tanks? And we'll never really know how many people are dead. They drop bombs on innocent girls while they sleep in their bed. Israel is a terror state, they're terrorists that terrorize. I'll testify my television, televise, I'm telling lies. How many more resolutions have to be violated? How many more children have to be annihilated? This is not a war, it is systematic genocide. But whatever they try, Palestine will never die. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and this is Palestine Declassified, where we highlight the struggle to liberate Palestine and expose the Zionist regime's frantic efforts to influence international policymakers and global public opinion. In today's show, we'll be examining the dirty tricks deployed by the Zionist lobby in Australia to undermine solidarity with Palestine, including Benjamin Netanyahu's extraordinary outburst against the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. In our first report, Latif Abouchakra highlights some examples of the fabricated anti-Semitic attacks in Australia and how Mossad, Israel's secret intelligence service, is implicated in this contemptible scam.
In 2025, Australian law enforcement revealed that several high-profile anti-Semitic terrorist plots were actually what they called a criminal con job, orchestrated by organised crime networks. But were they, in reality, a massive push by Zionist regime lobbyists and entryists to destroy Australian support for the Palestinians was underway? The strategy involved faking anti-Semitic attacks. Mossad has been extremely active in supplying false data to the Australian government, and the occupation forces have been active in collaboration with Zionist groups in Australia. It began shortly after the launch of Al-Aqsa Flood, with the famous Sydney Opera House protest in October 2023. Initial media reports and social media videos alleged that "Gas the Jews" was chanted by a small group of individuals during a large pro-Palestinian rally. A subsequent independent forensic analysis by New South Wales Police determined with overwhelming certainty that this was false. But the Jewish supremacists pressed on, and in October 2024, a kosher deli was allegedly set on fire, and there was an attempt to break into a brewery. In December, there was an arson attack on a synagogue, and in January 2025, a caravan was discovered in Sydney's northwest containing industrial explosives and a hit list of Jewish synagogues. On March 10, 2025, the Australian Federal Police announced the caravan plot was an elaborate hoax. The caravan had no detonator and was never going to cause a mass casualty event. All of these events were then described by the police as being the work of a criminal gang who were paid for their alleged crimes. Some months later, conflict between Australia and the Zionist entity followed after Australia's decision in early August to recognize a Palestinian state. A week later, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, accused the Albanese government of choosing to fuel anti-Semitism by cancelling the visa of the far-right Israeli politician Simcha Rothman ahead of a planned speaking tour. A day later, Benjamin Netanyahu launched an extraordinary broadside against the Prime Minister. History will remember Albanese for what he is, a weak politician who betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jews.
These were extraordinary and dangerous acts of aggression orchestrated by a foreign nation on Australian soil.
10 days later, the Australian Police Intelligence Services and politicians went public with their view that the masterminds behind the criminal gang's fake anti-Semitism attacks was in fact the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. The Zionists made sure to take credit for the announcement, with government spokesperson David Mencer noting Benjamin Netanyahu's forthright intervention had been effective. Meanwhile, news reports claimed that Mossad had provided a tip-off or lead to ASIO, the Australian intelligence agency. This is a sure sign of Zionist penetration of Australian politics.
As usual, I'm joined in the studio by the co-director of the lobbying watchdog Spinwatch and the UK's leading scholarly critic of Israel, David Miller. David's also a senior research fellow at the Centre for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zayum University. Joining us as our guest contributor today is the Sydney-based journalist, writer and celebrated civil liberties advocate, Paul Gregoire. Welcome to the show. David, I mean, we used, aren't we, to the anti-Semitism scam being deployed in the UK, but I mean, this story about criminal gangs and hoax anti-Semitism in Australia seems to be on a whole new level. It's even more extraordinary, isn't it?
It is more extraordinary. It's clear that, I mean, the first one, the alleged Gas the Jews incident, was something which was hoaxed by Zionist groups in Sydney. But the others, including up to 14 separate events which were identified by the police as being anti-Semitic attacks, of them, they said 13 of them were done by this criminal gang, some of which had been paid for their activities. Now, it was very unclear what would be the motivation of paying for this criminal gang. So it was some hypothesis about they were trying to get their criminal mates out of jail on some kind of basis of leverage, but which of course was never going to happen and didn't happen. So the whole thing is a farrago. Why on earth would a criminal gang go to the effort of paying people to do this activity unless there was some ulterior motive? Now, of course, the Mossad stepped in and said, oh, well, the ulterior motive is the IRGC, it's the Iranians, which, of course, manifestly preposterous, but only succeeds in pointing the finger directly, I would say, at Mossad for having orchestrated the whole thing, although, of course, we've got no direct evidence of that so far.
No, so far. Well, Paul, I mean, you've seen this at close quarters, haven't you? I wonder whether you might just say a word or two about how this story developed.
I mean, in the late months of 2024, arson and graffiti attacks started happening in Greater Sydney, and these were the messaging at first was against Israel, but it eventually changed, so it was targeting Jewish people. But about 13 incidents happened in Greater Sydney between October and February, October 2024, February 2025. And on the 29th of January, after these have been going on for some months, it was leaked to the police that the caravan had been found with explosives in it. And at that point in time, the Deputy Police Commissioner admitted that, well, he told the public that he thought this was all a setup. Well, he suspected it was a setup, and it wasn't until the 10th of March that the Federal Police and the New South Wales Police got together and they said, we've worked this out, it is a setup. There are some organised Australian crime figures overseas orchestrating these crimes. They're hiring poor gig criminals in Sydney to carry out these crimes. The 29 people that they did end up arresting and taking into custody, none of them were shown to have ideological beliefs. They were not anti-Semitic, and what they gave across as what had happened was the people overseas were orchestrating the crimes because they had other criminal matters underway with the state, and they wanted to be able to tip them off about these anti-Semitic crimes in order to gain leniency for their own criminal matters that were unrelated.
No, indeed. Well, David, I mean, what about the Australian intelligence agency then? I mean, coming up with what seems like a kind of a Mossad-inspired proposition that Iran was to blame for the horrific Bondi Beach shooting. I mean, you mentioned it in your previous response. Would you say a bit more about that?
Well, so the Mossad did come up apparently with the idea or past evidence in relation to the Bondi Beach shootings in December last year.
Yes.
But prior to that, the Mossad said that they had come up with the evidence or provided tip-offs for the other anti-Semitic attacks, the ones which were hoaxes.
Sure.
So the police said they were hoaxes, and then the Australian intelligence agency came out and said, no, they weren't hoaxes, they were done by Iran. And then Mossad said, well, that was us. And the Australian intelligence agency said, no, we might have had some information from Mossad, but it was our idea.
Yeah,
and so they were trying to pretend it was their idea, but manifestly there was an involvement from the Australian, from the Mossad. So the question really is that, to what extent is it that the Australian Intelligence Agency was misled about this, and or to what extent was it actually bought into this idea?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure which is the worst.
No, indeed. No, indeed. Well, Paul, just say, what's your take then on Mossad's role?
Well, the Mossad idea, this came out of the blue because in March we'd been told that all of the crimes were orchestrated by Australian organised crime. But then in August last year, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, the domestic spying agency in Australia, they got up and they announced to the public that 2 of 14 attacks had been attributed to the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Everyone thought it was a bit of a preposterous idea that Iran had been carried out 2 of 14 anti-Semitic attacks. Around these attacks, the 2 attacks that they did single out as being having links to Iran. One of them was the firebombing of a Bondi brewery a Bondi deli, 3 nights before a brewery with a similar name had been burnt down. So Iran had got the right target, but wasn't implicated in the earlier wrong firebombing. The other firebombing that was attributed to Iran was the Melbourne synagogue firebombing. In that case, a communal car was used, and it had also been used in an unrelated shooting and another unrelated arson attack on a nightclub. So there were these strange ideas around these 2 they were only implicated in 2 of the crimes, and these crimes had strange anomalies around them as well.
Yeah. No, indeed. Well, David, I mean, this all rather begs the question then, doesn't it? That, is it likely that Mossad just simply lied to the Australian intelligence services, or were they just responsible for organising a series of false flags?
Well, it has to be the case that the most likely explanation for this is that Mossad orchestrated the whole thing.
Yeah.
Now, maybe they found out about this crime network and they exploited, but this story doesn't really hold up. The only plausible way of explaining it is to say that the Mossad did this. Now, even if they didn't do it, then what's happened is that they've provided the information to the ASIO, and they've gullibly swallowed it. Now, it's an indication, really, of the extent to which Australian intelligence agencies are desperate to keep in with the Mossad and with Israel. And of course, this has a history. Let's remember that the main intelligence cooperation between Australia and New Zealand, the US, Canada, and the UK is the Five Eyes Alliance, which of course Mossad is a sort of part-time, semi-detached has an involvement with. And of course, they've been involved, the Mossad, with Western intelligence agencies since 1971, since the Club de Burn incident. So there's a long-term attempt by Mossad to penetrate and infiltrate intelligence agencies. Now, I think probably what's been going on here is that they are being concerned about the recognition of the Palestinian state, the other example of the settler politician not allowed to come to Australia, but also someone will come on to talk about more, the fact that this member of the Australian Army was denied security clearance because of his closeness to Israel. That's a real indication of something which the Mossad would not be allowing. And I think probably what's happened is that they've brought the ASIO to heel.
Yeah. And for those that are inclined to dismiss all this as just conspiracy theory, let's be clear that Mossad has got a record, haven't they, of false flags going back many, many decades, haven't they?
Going back to before the creation of the State of Israel,
absolutely,
yes, of course.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, Paul, why is it that the police then seem to be more willing to tell the truth than Australia's politicians and the intelligence services?
That was very noticeable at the time, that the police, we had the New South Wales Premier talking up the caravan, how the caravan might have been a terror plot, might have been a mass casualty event, but the police seemed to be more honest about what they thought was going on. They were willing to say that they thought these crimes might be a setup early on in the game, and then when they had the full proof, they came across and said, these were all setups. And the other thing is, the police probably didn't have the local Zionist lobby in their ear, pressuring them into, a lot of this furor was also linked, without any direct link, to the pro-Palestinian movement. So that was always being criminalised at the same time as they were discussing these other crimes. So the politicians were also interested in passing a lot of tough on crime laws. They passed 3 bills. And we had an official New South Wales Parliament inquiry into whether the Premier understood whether the crimes might have been set up at the time they pushed forward the legislation. The outcome of that inquiry isn't in yet.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, we shall wait that outcome then with interest. But we're going to move on now to our next report, which covers the subjugation of Australia's domestic intelligence service by Israel's espionage agency.
It seems clear that the Australian Security and Intelligence Organization has been penetrated and suborned by the Mossad. Its absurd judgment that the IRGC was behind the anti-Semitism hoax attacks is a dramatic sign of Zionist power. What did the Mossad hope to gain? The infiltration, intimidation, and subordination of the Australian governing apparatus to Zionist priorities. We can see 4 ways in which this was accomplished. 1. The IRGC was swiftly listed as a terrorist group. 2. Suppression of critical voices on the genocide in Gaza, including journalists, academics, and cultural figures. 3. Campaigning for the suppression of the term intifada, or the phrase from the river to the sea. And 4. Zionist lobby groups upped the pressure for unique state protection for Jews only, including seeking the extension of the rules permitting armed Jewish militias from the Community Security Group, CSG, on Australian streets. The CSG is the key Zionist body weaponizing anti-Semitism in Australia. It sends its volunteers to the Zionist colony for security training with former security and intelligence personnel. It also reportedly tells volunteers to lie about the nature of the training they receive. They are told to refer to leadership training.
A big exclusive that Israeli intelligence helped Australia during its investigation into how Iran orchestrated the terror attacks on our soil. Israeli intelligence provided a tip or lead. I verified this with confidential sources today. Can you tell us any information about the intelligence Israel was able to provide Australia?
The ASIO declared that it had come to its fantastical conclusion on the IRGC involvement by itself, despite admitted Mossad tip-off. So either the agency is lying about being effectively directed by the Mossad to reach this conclusion, or it is unaware that this is the case. It's not obvious which would be worse. Either way, it suggests that much of the top reaches of Australian security and politics is suborned to Zionist interests. However, there are some signs of resistance in the ASIO itself. A long-running case starting in June 2023 involved an Australian Defence Force officer who had his security clearance revoked by ASIO due to his undeclared CSG training activities and contacts in Israel. In early 2025, a tribunal confirmed an earlier ASIO decision that his divided loyalty was incompatible with his obligations. The case should have led to investigations of the CSG or its collaboration with Zionist intelligence agencies. Indeed, the question of whether it functions as an asset of those agencies. But instead, the debate has gone in the opposite direction, with the New South Wales Premier deliberating on extending CSG armed activities after the Bondi attack. The CSG is Australia's prototype of a Jewish supremacist militia and would be seen as akin to paramilitarism if established by any other community group. That in itself is an indication of the Jewish supremacism embedded in policy and public discussion in Australia.
Well, David, what do you know about this so-called community security group then that was mentioned in our report just there?
Well, it's modelled on the Community Security Trust in the UK,
Nice
which
in
of
the
course
UK,
we've
yeah.
reported on many occasions, and it
Yeah.
does the same kinds of things. It has training with the Mossad, and this guy, this Australian soldier who went over there, and he's supposed to, under the rules of service, and that he was supposed to report any contacts with foreign governments, and he didn't report this, and indeed he was told by the CSG to report that he was on Jewish leadership training courses, right? Which was a lie, and he sort of admitted that. He said, "Well, I was always going to tell you the truth about that eventually."
Yeah.
And you can see this in the judgment, the tribunal judgment. Very fascinating little judgment. And so, of course, he effectively lied in that interview. And in particular, he said, "Yes, well, we were trained by the police, by the Israeli police, the Shabak."
Yes.
The Shabak is the Shin Bet. That's an
Indeed.
intelligence agency. It's not the police.
No,
so
absolutely.
it's incredible.
Indeed, it is incredible. But Paul, I mean, that tribunal judgment on the soldier who had his security clearance cancelled, it seemed pretty significant, didn't it? I mean, what did you make of it?
It was significant because he had 2 levels of clearance in the Army Reserves, and he was found to have more allegiance to Israel than he does to Australia. But the big debate at the moment around CSG is, since the Bondi Beach massacre, then now the debate is whether the authorities are going to allow CSG to be armed when providing security at Jewish events in public, which, opens up a whole kettle of fish about whether, other communities, other sectors of the community might want to have their own armed security as well.
Yeah, indeed. Well, David, I mean, would you say then that tribunal ruling and the initial cancellation by the Australian Intelligence Service was a sign that the Zionists aren't getting it all their own way in Australia?
Well, I think it certainly was. I mean, the idea that would happen is something which would be quite unusual. If it happened in the UK, I think people would absolutely lose their minds. But it's an indication of, if you look at the way in which they made the decision and the reasoning that they had and how it was examined in the tribunal, very sensible and eminently sensible. He clearly broken the rules, and then he lied about it. But you can't imagine that happening in any way really in this country. So that's an indication of the difference. And that if you take a rational approach to disloyalty amongst Jewish Zionists, then what you would find is that they would be excluded from certain parts of the society because they're clearly not trustworthy. So it's an indication of a kind of pushback within the ASIO, but at the leadership level, clearly they want to be seen to be loyal.
Yeah, of course. Well, Paul, I mean, the clampdown on dissent and the penetration of government seem to be pretty advanced, though, don't they, in Australia?
Well, I would have to say that in terms of public protest and the pro-Palestinian movement, the clampdown in Australia hasn't been quite as severe on the civil society as what we've been witnessing in European countries, or especially in Germany, or even in England. We've been watching people arrested around displaying the words Palestine Action or Intifada. We haven't gone quite there yet, but the Bondi Beach massacre has given the impetus for that to occur. So right now in Sydney, since Christmas Eve right up until March, we've got a ban on public protests. These laws were just rolled out on Christmas Eve because of the Bondi Beach massacre, and we've got a ban on protests now, public protests, so we've got these rolling repressions coming now.
Sure, indeed. And given what's been happening in Australia, then, David, I mean, is this just another example of how Pax Judaica is expanding? I
think so. What we're seeing is the emergence into public view of the massive influence which the Zionists have all over the world in incredible ways which we never really thought of before. And you can see that with the debate about the arming of the CSG. They already have license to carry guns in certain circumstances, and they're talking about extending that. This is the beginning of a Jewish militia. And of course, there will never be the case that Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs would be allowed to carry arms in the same kind of way. So this is about Jewish supremacist imposition of order. But I think to go back to respond to Paul a little bit there. Of course, he's right about the relative freedom in Australia, but I would also point to the fact that the IRGC was listed as a terror organisation in Australia, and just this week,
even gone that far.
Just this week in the UK, the Labour government, so far in the pockets of the Zionist movement that you couldn't believe it, has declared that it won't do that. So things are happening in a kind of different way, but they're heading in the same direction.
No, indeed. And briefly then, Paul, I mean, just say quickly, will you just, because I haven't got much time left, how is the movement in Australia fighting back? I mean, I saw that the Adelaide the Writers Festival had to be cancelled when they withdrew an invitation to an Australian-Palestinian writer, and everybody said, well, we're just not going to participate then. I mean, so there's, I guess, there's an example of that. But just say a little bit about how the movement is fighting back.
The movement has been strong. The pro-Palestinian movement has been strong in Australia. In August, we had at least 100,000 people walk across the Sydney Harbour Bridge for Palestine. And right up until the Bondi Beach massacre, it seemed like the moral panic of the last 2 years around anti-Semitism had subsided. But the Bondi Beach massacre, which was a tragedy, a heinous crime carried out by ISIS, people inspired by ISIS, has brought on a ton of repression against the pro-Palestinian movement. So we're seeing some of these repressions that we've been watching in Europe just becoming now.
No, indeed. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today, so I'm going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank our guest, Paul Gregoire. And if you want to see more of our content, you can follow the show on X, Facebook, Rumble and Telegram. And make a date to join us again on Palestine Declassified next week, when I'll be back alongside David Miller with more revelations and information that you won't find in the corporate media. But until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.